Hey everyone, this is Harmon, and you've tuned into Comedy History 101, where we, today, school you in the comedy of 2024. Yes, today we have a very special episode. It's all our favorite episodes from the past year. In fact, it's almost all our episodes from the past year. And we do a little recap as we share some mulled wine around the fireplace and revel in the entity which is that of comedy history. This past year, we've had some of my favorite guests on Comedy History 101, which includes Emmy Award-winning producer-writer Jim Vallery from Arrested Development, Paul Bellini from Kids in the Hall, Joey Kamen, one of the original Comedy Store players, Brett Hodge, who directed the documentary I Am Chris Farley, director Josh Forbes, who directed the documentary Gallagher. I'm not just reading this, but I am. Along with comedian photographer Dan Dion, former Jimmy Kimmel comedy producer Adam Spiegelman. And wait, it gets better. In this episode, we have a special section solely dedicated to our Canadian guests and their history in not only Canadian comedy, but worldwide global comedy, which is presented by our friend Jean-François, who helped me produce some of these episodes with these amazing guests. And remember, this is just a bite-sized sampler pack of 2024, where you can go back and check out the full entire episode in all its podcasting glory. But before we jump into the episode, if this is your first time here, take some time to like, subscribe, and comment on Comedy History 101, wherever you get your podcasts, or on our site, comedyhistory101.com, or on Instagram, comedyhist101. And I know that this is the 2024 recap, but moving into 2025, a few quick plugs on Saturday, January 4th, 7 p.m. at the Brooklyn Art House. I'll be presenting my show, That 80s Improv Challenge. Yes, 3 improv teams compete by creating scenes inspired by clips from obscure videos of the 1980s. It's a hit show which I just took to Toronto. And on January 12th, 7 p.m. at the People's Improv Theater, yes, AI versus Human Roast Battle returns for 2025, where we have a human rapper who is going to be taking on AI Jesus in a comedy roast battle of tomorrow. And you can find out all about these show dates on my site, harmonleon.com, or on the social medias at harmonleon. And now, without further ado,
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
excuse me!
Comedy History 101.
Okay, let's do this. Let's do it. Let's kick things off with my interview with Emmy Award-winning writer-producer for Arrested Development and the Golden Girls, Jim Vallery. Jim gave us a master class in comedy writing and producing and shared stories on what it was like to have Larry David as a neighbor.
Like that's kind of been the surreal stuff for me because, like I said, in the 80s, I lived in the same building and I knew Larry David and Kenny Kramer, and they did live across the hall from each other.
Yeah, Kenny Kramer gives the Seinfeld tours now in New York.
Yeah. A sweet guy, and he was a stand-up too. The whole thing, it's not work what I do. I've never been in a room going, oh, when can I get home? It's like you're sitting around with funny people making jokes all day.
And what were you taking your inspirations from for, when scripting or just in the early days of Arrested Development?
We all thought that the show was going to get canceled next week. So we were, Mitch was like, let's just get as much as we possibly can because they're going to cancel us. The first 3 years, Mitch basically had two rules. Like, everybody has to have a story in 22 minutes, which no one has done with this many characters. It's way better if the story can overlap and connect. It's like, nice to connect those dominoes. And let's not try to do jokes that we've seen a million times. And, back then it's just like, I remember the idea of like, wait a minute, we're going to put a blue handprint on the wall. And then in the next episode, without acknowledging it, we'll just see the blue handprint still, like that was what?
What do you think either Arrested Development's place is in comedy history or your place in comedy history?
Oh, I have no place in comedy history. That's a ridiculous, absurd question. But I would say what Arrested will be is I think, I as we were writing it, I would say, this show might not ever get a giant audience, but people who want to get into comedy, this will be their favorite show. This will be the show that helps them say, oh my God, I can do that. Oh, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that coming. Or, wow, what a great way of doing that. And that has kind of proven to be true. I know a lot of young writers who are like, oh my God, Arrested. And it's like, good, it's done its job. It's indoctrinated another person into comedy. And right now, I can sit back and I can watch, comedy has gotten much better. The hard comedy jokes, the multicam things, we made about 1 million of them. Maybe it's time we put that formula to rest, or find a new way of doing it. If Arrested has a legacy, it's going to be like it inspired a lot of good comedy writers.
So a lot of the guests in 2024 were friends of mine, and I feel very honored and humbled to have such interesting and talented friends in the world of comedy providing their comedy history, such as Adam Spiegelman, who was the comedy producer for Jimmy Kimmel Live. Adam gave us a deep dive into producing comedy and comedians for this iconic late-night talk show, where he brought such comedians as Neil Hamburger, Eddie Pepitone, and Andy Dick to the airwaves.
Now, I think this is setting you up for something you sent me, but who was the favorite comedian that you booked on the show? And I'm throwing this out to you. His last name is a food item.
Yeah. So again, the show is struggling. We're trying to get attention and at least book spots. That was my job, and it was so hard in the beginning. Now, obviously it's not, but my boss said, I want you to book something so unique, so crazy that I'm going to think you're crazy and that I could even fire you, that this is such a bad idea. And, I want you to take it. So I was like, got it. So my brother, Mike, found this CD because this independent rock label, put out Neil Hamburger's comedy CDs because he used to open up for rock bands. But his whole act is that he's really terrible and offensive and awful. I pitch him, and I think my boss was like, I don't get it, or I get it. Let's see. He shows it to Jimmy, and Jimmy's like, this is great. So we all assume he's going to bomb. And it's hard to, real stand-ups aren't doing well. Oh, and the other guest that night was Yoko Ono, which was an awesome get. So before he starts, they just whisper to Yoko Ono, this guy is a really good performance artist. So she just lit up. That's like her world. Yeah. He goes out there, and half the audience hates him, half the audience gets it. Our audience loved him like he was a real comic. So when we were cutting to people in the audience, they were laughing for real. He was so great. He did such a great job. And then the comics did well. I don't know why. I just needed to break that kind of curse or something.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
Dave Juskow was our very first guest of 2024. He is a New York comedian who gave us a history of the legendary Comedy Cellar, which is the Yankee Stadium of New York comedy clubs. He got his start in the early days of the Cellar, working alongside Jon Stewart, Dave Chappelle, Colin Quinn, Dave Attell, Amy Schumer, a regular who's who of comedy. And what I loved about this episode is I love New York history, and like on every WTF episode, I love like stories of the early days of iconic comedy clubs.
To this day, if you see a guy like Dave Attell, and he's always at 1 a.m. at the Cellar, And nobody understands why he's not a little further along, even though anybody in the stand-up comedy world knows he's the greatest comic that may, when all is said and done, have ever lived. And Dave Chappelle will tell you that, and Chris Rock will tell you that, and all the best people in comedy will tell you Dave Attell is the greatest. And when you see him 1 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday at the Cellar, it's like seeing a Bob Dylan, and it's the reason you want to live in New York City, is to have that experience and see Dave Attell somehow do 20 minutes of new stuff because he's so afraid that his peers are going to think he's a hack. Comes up with 20 minutes of new stuff every night. It's unbelievable. And that's how the reputation grew, because it was more of an intelligent brand of comedy. You weren't there to split your gut laughing. You were trying to see these people get it together.
Dave Juskow came back as a guest on June 13th to give us a comedy history of Dangerfields, which was a New York comedy club named after part-time owner Rodney Dangerfield. And the deal with Dangerfield's Comedy Club, it was just plain creepy. You might remember Dangerfields from the movie The Joker, and the legendary Young Comedian Special, which launched the careers of Sam Kinison, Andrew Dice Clay, and Louis Anderson. And Dave gave us a masterclass history on this creepy comedy club.
You know, I did a show, and it was a very surprising place. The place was like a club right out of Goodfellas. And there were private tables, and you'd sit there, and it was all red interior, and it just looked like something was going to go down there eventually, like a hit of some sort. I mean, that's what it was. There's lanterns on the table. I mean, it was really a weird, strange club I've never seen the likes of before. And when you got up on stage, there was a piano and a very bright light in your face, worse than a spotlight. You could not see into the audience, which I guess was intended.
Why is that?
So mafia guys could sit in the back and just not be seen by the comic, and you couldn't really make fun of anybody because you couldn't see past the light. And there were probably like 5 people in the audience, and I was still thrilled. I was thrilled doing my set at 2 a.m. for the breakfast crowd on a Sunday. I went home that night. I got home at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up my mom, and I told her I just performed at Dangerfield. It was so exciting. And then I don't think I ever went back there again. And it just wasn't, like you said, the normal club, like the other ones that just seemed normal. It was a very strange club.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Like I mentioned on podcasts such as WTF, my favorite moments are kind of the early stories of iconic comedy clubs, most particularly the Comedy Store. And our guest, Joey Kamen, was there right from the start. He first started performing at the Comedy Store in 1974, alongside such up-and-coming comedians as David Letterman, Sam Kinison, Jay Leno, Jim Carrey, Richard Pryor. And you also might remember Joey as a voice actor and the voice of one of the Smurfs.
What was your first impressions of Sam Kinison coming from the Houston Comedy Outlaws?
Well, he was really doing Bill Hicks, in my opinion. That's my opinion. You know, he was really doing.
Bill Hicks was another guy who was like wasn't he about 21 when he started going to the store? 19?
I didn't really know him that well. I used to see him in the hallway before he'd go on. I didn't know how brilliant he was. Because like you're in your own mind a lot, you know. Comedians are self-centered, you know, you used to concentrate on what you're doing. I didn't really realize what he was doing until later on. I mean, I would just say, hey, Bill, how's it going? You know, and he's a really nice man. Kinison, you know, I mean, you know, at first I didn't get what he was doing. I mean, this guy just on stage screaming, what is this shit? You know, now he kind of grew on me. He kind of grew on me, and I found him very funny. But, you know, it's not like I immediately went, oh, wow, look at this. You know, look, after you watch, you know, when you see Richard Pryor every night for hundreds of shows, and Paul Mooney, I worked with Paul for hundreds of shows at the Comedy Store. And you see guys like this, I'm not going to be impressed. You say, hey, go check this guy out. Like, I don't care. You know, what are they going to do that's better than them? You know?
What was your first impression of Letterman? I mean, he was a weatherman, so at least he had some chops.
From Indiana, he had a beard and he wore these like striped shirts like this way. And, you know, he was really funny. I mean, he really, and it was a sick sense of humor, very dark, very dark. I mean, I still remember his jokes, you know.
But did it take a while for him to get his complete like sea legs, or was he like a fully formed comic right out of the box?
No. He was like a writer, and I think he was writing jokes for Jimmy Walker.
Yeah, wasn't Jimmy Walker the big star
Jimmy
of
Walker
the day?
made the Comedy Store. Jimmy Walker was a big star, and he had good times. His name would be on the marquee. If it wasn't for, he'd pack the place. He'd come from the studio after he's like taping Good Times and doing all that stuff. And then at night he'd perform there and pack it out. They all wanted to see JJ.
Now, Dan Dion is the world's most prolific comedy portrait photographer. He's also a friend of mine from the San Francisco comedy scene. And he has photographed such iconic comedians as Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, Maria Bamford, Zach Galifianakis, and on and on and on. And you can find his work exhibited at places like the Edinburgh Festival, Just for Laughs Montreal, the Gotham Comedy Club. And it was great to catch up with Dan and learn the nuts and bolts behind creating iconic comedian portrait shots.
What comedians were you couldn't believe you were there photographing them? And again, I'll lead you more into this, that, you've done like Don Rickles and Jonathan Winters. I mean, did you ever have those experiences? Like, it's like really surreal that you're...
Yeah. On the same day, in the morning, I was photographing Conan O'Brien in his office. And in the afternoon, I was photographing Stephen Colbert in his office. And, literally like in their personal office, not anywhere, like in their little sanctum, Conan had, the colored index cards tacked up on the wall of what the show was going to be like that night and all these things. That was really cool. But there's also been times when I photographed my like comedy heroes from when I was a kid, when I got to photograph Steve Martin, that for me was just like, oh man, when I got to shoot George Carlin, that was, probably the biggest thrill for me as a photographer. And then to later find out that the picture that I took of him, he said that it was the photo that he wanted to be remembered by. And then he died 3 weeks later. I had given him a photo when I saw him the second time. I gave him the photo, and then a couple of months later, maybe I get a phone call and it's just like, Dan, like, yeah, like it's George Carlin. Like, holy shit. And he says, I really, really love that picture you gave me. I want to give one to my daughter. Wow. And I said, that's a real, that's a real compliment. Thanks, George. Just let me know. I'll send it. And he said, now, and so, just tell me what I owe you. And I said, oh, no.
It's on the house.
I'm not going to do that. And he said, Dan, I'm insisting here. I'm paying for it. He wouldn't take it for free, which is the opposite of most celebrities.
Another friend of mine I interviewed was Rhonda Hansome, who portrayed legendary comedian Moms Mabley. Now, if you're not familiar with Moms Mabley, she was the first successful female stand-up comedian whose career spanned over 50 years. And Rhonda, who's appeared on SNL, The Arsenio Hall Show, and has opened for Aretha Franklin and Diana Ross, shared stories on portraying legendary comedian Moms Mabley.
For the benefit of some of you children now that don't know Mom, that's the name, Mom. M-O-M frontwards, M-O-M backwards, upside down, W-O-W. Wow.
You knew a lot about Moms Mabley beforehand. What did you learn about her through the process of doing this show that really kind of surprised you or that you didn't know before?
She began in show business like many of us. She was quite glamorous. And I found out that she actually had some teeth removed so that she could have a more humorous look. She added that ruminating with her lips, and also that bug-eyed punctuation to her performances.
This year, I also interviewed a lot of documentary filmmakers, of course, in the comedy history genre. I talked to director Josh Forbes about his documentary Gallagher, who gave astute insights into everyone's favorite watermelon smashing comedian.
Did you feel that he sort of hated the watermelon thing at the end. Like one of those things, like say, you know,
Oh yeah.
something like Hunter S. Thompson. Everyone expected him to be the party guy, you know, because that was
Right.
And he hated that at the end. Was Gallagher like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's both, like, you know, if it means that he's going to get, you know, he would wear Gallagher shirts and stuff. So like he, you know, he wasn't trying to hide it, you know. So if he was walking around and somebody's like, "Oh, hey, watermelon guy," he liked it because it, you know, it's his claim to fame. But then he also hated it, you know. I mean, in the same way that I'm sure, you know, like when Radiohead got tired of playing Creep, or, you know, and it makes complete sense. Like, you know, it very much has the feeling of being like a one-hit wonder. You know, and that's just the curse. It's funny. I shot a commercial with John Cena, and I told him about Gallagher and how he was upset about his the watermelon thing. And John Cena was like, "Oh man, he should be grateful to those watermelons. Those watermelons got him all across the country, man. Those watermelons made him famous, man." I was like, "Dude, you gotta come talk to Gallagher." You know?
Yeah, and what I was surprised by is the depths of fans. Like someone like Bill Burr would be, you know, a fan of Gallagher. Jimmy Kimmel, you know. I mean, I can understand like Letterman, because I did they start out at the Comedy Store around the same time?
Yeah. He was part of that whole crew, I think, of like, Letterman and Leno and Seinfeld and, you know, Robin Williams, I think, was sort of known as like somebody who might have pilfered or, you know, stolen some of Gallagher's jokes, or, you know,
well,
or
you know the stories of that.
Yeah, absorb those jokes, and then
them.
you know, in the heat of the moment, they came back out from his subconscious. But yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to me because he really, I don't know, he held on to a lot of resentment, and there's a lot of bitterness towards the success of those guys. I mean, I don't know, there's no like gentle way to put it. It's just like, you know, he would ask me, he's just like, how come Jay has a talk show? How come Dave has a talk show? And I'm like, you know, what I want to say is like, because you don't talk to people. Like you, you do monologues, not dialogues, man.
I also talked to Alan Bernstein on his documentary When We Went Mad, a documentary of proportions, which featured interviews from such icons as Bryan Cranston, Gilbert Gottfried, Judge Apatow, and Quentin Tarantino, who, along with Alan, shared their love of Mad magazine.
Mad artists and writers escaped the Holocaust. Obviously, those are two things that you don't think go hand in hand, Mad magazine and the Holocaust. But to see their work and then kind of have a slightly different take on it, knowing what their background is, it opened up a little bit more about them.
And who was the artist? Was this one of the artists you're referring to? He did the parody Holcomb's Heroes.
This was the writer Larry Siegel who wrote it, and he is not one of a Holocaust survivor, but he grew up in that era, the Greatest Generation, and he, you know, his job is already to make fun of the ridiculous. And I guess in his eyes, he thought the concept of a sitcom taking place in a concentration camp or a prisoner of war camp was beyond ridiculous, and so he wanted to expose that and flipped it into taking Hogan's Heroes, making it Hockman's Heroes, and applying the same mad satire to a concentration camp. And again, it's all about exposing the ridiculousness of television and the movies, etc.
And of course, and I don't know why I'm saying of course, I talked to Brent Hodge, who directed the documentary I Am Chris Farley, and we both agreed any day that you get to talk about Chris Farley is a good day.
What sketch do you think best exemplifies Chris Farley, both his humor and the person he was?
Matt Foley, Man Down by the River. It's everything. And the way that they mastered it from Second City over to Saturday Night Live, Bob Odenkirk wrote it. The Bob Odenkirk writes some of your first characters is, you can't go wrong. Like, what a combination. And I think the audience, I don't know, you just like rewatch Matt Foley, stop and start it, go through all of them. There's so many versions of it that he has on SNL. But like, I just think if Chris was alive, that would have been a movie for sure. There had to have been a Matt Foley movie at some point come out. But that one for me is like, that's it. It's like a Midwest guy, motivational speaker, so much sadness, so much comedy, so much physicality. He breaks a table, he falls back through the window. That is like the perfect Chris Farley sketch.
And this year, I talked to a good handful of TV comedy writers, most particularly Susan Silver, who is a trailblazer in the world of sitcom writing back in the days when there wasn't a lot of women doing that job. She began her career on the Mary Tyler Moore Show during an era when comedy writing was overwhelmingly dominated by men. Susan started as a casting director on the TV show Laugh-In, and like a showbiz zealot, Susan's path has crossed with such icons as Elvis, Jim Morrison, and Lenny Bruce.
And because this podcast is comedy history, could you tell us more about your encounter with Lenny Bruce?
Oh, yes. Do they know who Lenny Bruce was?
Well, this is the point of this podcast, is to give people these chapters of comedy history.
Okay. But I was in college and I went to a party New Year's Eve, and this woman came in and we became friends and we started talking. She had been a stripper. Ooh, that was interesting. And her son was Lenny Bruce. And I knew of Lenny Bruce. Of course, everybody did. And she said, do you have a date tonight? I said, no, I'm just with a group of people. She said, would you like to meet my son? I said, who's your son? She said, Lenny Bruce. I said, yeah. She said, well, let me call him, have him come over and I'll fix you up. So he came to the party and we were all like in awe. I remember we were sitting on the floor and he was talking and he pointed to the ceiling. There was some fresco up there and we didn't know. And it was like, oh my God. Anyway, he asked me out. Again, my uncle said, no, you're not. I said, why? He said, because he's a druggie and he's 20 years older than you are and you're not going. I said, I'm going. He said, oh God, I'm coming with you. So my uncle came on a date with me. Lenny Bruce was doing a show at a club and afterward we had a drink. And my uncle and he got along great and I was terrified. I hardly talked at all. And he wrote on a napkin, Susan will go to the corner, but she's afraid to go around. It's really, really smart and very sexy. And he was, he was before his time. Richard Pryor and a lot of people that came after him admired him. Everybody loved him. And he was persecuted to death.
I also talked to Stan Zimmerman, who was a writer for The Golden Girls, Roseanne, and Gilmore Girls. And he also wrote the feature film A Very Brady Sequel. And he gave some great insights on what sounds potentially like a nightmare working for the Roseanne show.
Just working on Roseanne, one of the things you mentioned is they made the staff wear numbers so they didn't have to memorize their names.
Tom and Roseanne, the first day of filming, they thought it would be funny because she was known to fire writers just right and left all the time. So that instead of having her to learn their names, there were 21 writers that season, they would just give us t-shirts and they could just point at you, number 8, you're gone, get in your car. So
how'd that make you feel?
Well, I didn't know why. They were just like, Tom and Roseanne got us gifts for the first day. And I'm like, cool. And they said they're numbered t-shirts. And I'm like, oh my God, my birthday is October 13th for people that want to send me flowers and things. So I pushed people away to get in line to be the 13th person. And as we're waiting to go, everyone learned what the reason was. And all the writers are getting really mad. And I'm like, oh, fuck, that's twisted, But I still have my t-shirt. I've worn it, I think, twice. I did wear it on CNN when I talked about the firing of Roseanne. And then I wore it, there was a special Roseanne reunion for the strike out in front of the old studio where we used to film that. And of course, Tom Arnold shows up and spills espresso all over the shirt when he hugs me. I was like, well, that's
on purpose perfect. Or just
no, he just went to hug me and he banged into me. He's a big guy. And I was like, well, if I'm going to get coffee on this, that he'd be the right person for that event. So it worked out perfect.
And lastly, I talked to Joel Thurm, who was the casting director for such films as Airplane, Grease, Rocky Horror, as well as being the head of NBC casting for a solid decade. And we did a deep dive into casting in Hollywood and what it's like to turn down Tom Cruise and Madonna.
Found on YouTube the link of Madonna auditioning for Fame.
Yeah.
You know, she's awkward. What were some of like the moments where you think you saw someone and either your judgment was better than what they wanted, per se, Tom Cruise, or someone like Madonna, you go, no way?
Well, they're two different things. No, with Madonna, it was, she was great until she started reading, and then she was terrible. So there was really no discussion then if she had read well. But I mean, because she can act in certain roles, but the part of the virginal girl next door is not exactly in her wheelhouse. So that's not her. The Tom Cruise is one of my biggest mistakes. I nixed him for a project which is basically Superboy without being called Superboy. And I think he gave a terrible audition, both in the room and on tape. And my assistant at that time, Mary Buck, who went on to become a successful casting director, said, "Joel, you taught me not to judge by one test. Why are you being so adamant?" And I was just stupid. I made a mistake.
And now I like to turn it over to my friend Jean-François, who will do a rundown of the Canadian portion of this year's episodes. And also a big thanks to Jean-François because he helped me co-produce these episodes. So a big Canadian thank you to him.
Thanks, Harmon. Hello, bonjour, CH101 listeners. I'm Jean-François, and it's been a delight to help share Canadian stories on the show. Netflix is dropping a new 2-part documentary titled Jerry Springer Fights, Camera, Action, which reminded me of our first collaboration for the November 2023 episode, The Jerry Springer Show Infiltration. I got the idea from your Chop and Steal interview where you mentioned trying to infiltrate Springer with a fabricated sex scandal and put you in touch with Ian Sirota, who with a few other Canadian stand-ups managed to do so in the early 90s to much notoriety. At the time, we didn't have the infamous footage of Ian's character confronting Johnny Guardhouse's character for having an affair with his girlfriend. Well, we found the clip. In 2024, we continued sharing stories from the Great White North, including Just for Laughs, canceled with Darren Frost. Hearing Frosty talk about the yearly, almost Knights of the Round Table-esque gathering at Just for Laughs, where icons of American and Canadian stand-up comedy would discuss who they thought was the best and brightest new comedian at the festival.
Industry did come to this festival. It was greatly attended by audience and 9-to-5ers, but the industry came for two reasons. One, to find talent. But let's not lie here, kid around. Number two, Montreal is an adult Disneyland. There's no doubt about it. Strippers and coke were big in the 80s and 90s, and that's a lot of reason the industry came to that town, was for the party aspect. Montreal also always knew how to throw a good party, so you had Comedy Central parties, all these parties sponsored by big network money, and who doesn't want to have a weekend? If you've never been to Montreal, it's an amazing place. It's like a little bit of Europe in North America. So there's also that bit of the headed drag into the equation. But yes, the industry did come. New Faces was the most important. And then you had other kind of offshoot shows that weren't as important, but still were quite good, because you had the ethnic show and you had other smaller branded shows that you could really lock into. So there is comics that also got deals from that type of show as well.
Yuk-Yuks with Evan Carter. Although some consider Yuk-Yuks a powerful monopoly today, we forget how important the Canadian stand-up chain's development was to establishing comedy-friendly venues and nurturing talent throughout the country. Oh, and hearing Harmon learn the term peeler was pretty funny, eh?
Like you said, like SCTV was there, and, Second City's always been around, but it was really kind of like the 80s when like stand-up comedy, both for Yuk-Yuks and Canada, kind of got its footing.
Yeah, because Yale started branching out and people started going to the club. You started really building a following of people who just really love stand-up. And what was what was happening was that, Howie Mandel came on the scene, Jim Carrey came on the scene.
Yeah, do you remember any of their like early performances? Or I always love those origin stories of like seeing someone on their very first time.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I saw Jim on stage, it was, you just went, yeah, this guy's, there's just something there as far as not only his ability to do voices, but he's just a rubbery guy, and his ability to make faces. You see Howie Mandel and how it would just be so outrageous, because what you're doing, you're coming off the time of Steve Martin, and as that sort of character was so, that would morph into what Howie was doing.
Sean Cullen, a retrospective. Learning how Les Moonves of CBS put the kibosh on a hilariously wild-sounding series called Legend of the Falls just because he didn't like monkeys? That's bananas.
Out of all the projects you've done, and you have like an IMDb page the size of like a small phone book, what have you found the most creatively challenging and rewarding?
Well, I mean, I did my own show up here in Canada. They've had a mental lapse, and they gave me 6 episodes, and I wrote all of them. And it was a really weird show. I wanted it to be kind of like the Jack Benny show, where it's like at a house, and but I would talk directly to the audience. The audience would yell back at me, and weird things would happen. There was a Sasquatch that lived next door with an evil woman who wanted to kill me, and it was weird, but it didn't land well here in Canada because they just don't get it. But when I get Canadian journalists always ask, why do Canadians have such a great sense of humor? And I'm like, that is not true. They don't. There's a few really great comics, and there are great comedians in Canada, but I think the general run of Canadian sense of humor is really bad. And it shows in the side of television that we make.
The Kids in the Hall with Paul Bellini. Hearing Paul masterfully break down why he believes Chicken Lady is the greatest comedy character of all time.
And I went to see The Kids in the Hall, and it was a revelation. I remember sitting there thinking, I think I'm looking at my future, which was very correct, obviously, and a very strong feeling. I would say all of 85, that was that process of getting to know the other 4, going to all their shows.
So those early shows were at the Rivoli in Toronto.
Well, the Rivoli was a rock and roll bar, but on Monday night, it was they didn't do bands. Somebody convinced them to allow comedians to take over. And the kids took advantage of that. And they started to do shows every second Monday. And the insistence was always on new material. So they were always generating sketches. They didn't want to refine what they had. They wanted to keep adding to the pile. And I think they probably had about 80 or 90 sketches by the time Lorne Michaels discovered them. I mean, they worked very hard. They were very productive.
And what was your part in those early shows?
It was kind of like as a fan more than anything. I mean, I'm not a performer in the same way. And to see them, you understand what performance is. But I would make myself handy. I would design posters. I would work the door. I would maybe sometimes do the lighting board. A friend of mine had a video camera. We would borrow it and shoot a lot of the early shows because I felt immediately that this has to be archived. The other thing I think is good is when you look at a character like Chicken Lady, which I think is maybe the best character ever created, like ever in the world, she comes with a built-in failure, which is that she's utterly repulsive physically, and yet she's insatiably horny. And she has to satisfy her lust for men with that body and voice. And you can imagine, and never gets down. Like her attitude never becomes maudlin or sad or serious. She is constantly upbeat in her quest to satisfy her lust. I mean, come on. That goes beyond brilliant writing. I can't even imagine how Mark put all that together to get to that character.
Here are some of the episodes we're working on for 2025. The Birth of Cask, the Canadian Association of Stand-Up, Sketch, and Improvisational Comedians with Sandra Bellini. History of the Nubian Show with Kenny Robinson. Whose Line Is It Anyway? The BBC Years with Colin Mockery. It was great to have you bring some of your comedy shows to Toronto, Harmon, before your incoming president raises the drawbridge. You know, if Canada and US relations ever needed a little humor, it's now. On behalf of everyone from the 51st state, I mean Canada, wishing everyone in America a Happy New Year, Bonne Nouvelle Année.
Once again, a big thanks to Jean-François, who helped me produce those episodes. And a big thanks to my friend John Posel, who helped me edit some of this year's episodes. And also a huge thanks to our guests and you, the listeners. If you weren't listening, we'd be like Helen Keller falling in a forest, not making a sound, as that joke goes. And since this is Comedy History 101, for our In Memoriam section, let's celebrate the comedy of such icons as Richard Lewis, Jim Abrams, Mitzi McCall, Bob Newhart, Hiram Caston, Catherine McGee, Martin Mull, Tony Knight, Rudy Morona, Diane Ford, Kristen Durang, Joyce Randolph, and Joe Flaherty. Thank you for bringing us comedy history. And sorry, O.J. Simpson, you didn't make our list. And we will be back in 2025 with brand spanking new episodes. Once again, take some time to like, subscribe, and comment on Comedy History 101. Share it with a friend who might not have heard our podcast before. Also, the quick plugs: January 4th, 7 p.m. at the Brooklyn Art House, that 80s Improv Challenge. And January 12th, 7 p.m. at the People's Improv Theater, AI versus Human Roast Battle. And you can find out all about my show dates at Harmon Leon on the social medias or harmonleon.com. And of course, you can find out more about Comedy History 101 on our site, comedyhistory101.com, or on Instagram at comedyhist101. Until next time, bye-bye.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Comedy History 101.